Elizabeth de Montfort stepped onto the terrace as if the whole world existed for her amusement. Her wrists jingled with thin gold bracelets, her neck glittered with a necklace worth more than the house of anyone in the park. Her slim silhouette, clad in expensive silk, attracted stares, but not because of her beauty. People looked at her with a silent mixture of admiration and fear. She was a woman whose opinion could elevate or destroy. "What a miserable day," she said, looking around the park, where the sun played softly on the green grass and a light breeze fluttered the leaves. Her eyes, cold and penetrating, glided over people's faces, as if searching for someone to appreciate and devalue. But her gaze stopped on the boy. He was sitting in a wheelchair, a little apart from the others. His hands, thin, almost transparent, held a pencil. On his lap was a notebook in which he was drawing something in concentration. His head was slightly bowed, his hair hiding his face. It was as if the boy was invisible to those around him, but not to Elizabeth. "How ridiculous," she whispered, raising a perfectly manicured eyebrow. Her lips stretched into a mocking smile. She stepped a little closer, as if studying an exotic animal at the zoo. "Who brings this here anyway?" she said loudly, not hiding her disdain. Her voice, cold as the winter wind, cut through the silence, causing several passers-by to turn around. But the boy didn't look up. He continued drawing as if he hadn't heard. He gripped his pencil a little tighter, and the line he drew on the paper began to shake. Elizabeth leaned toward her friend, dressed equally exquisitely, and let out a short laugh. "Do you have any idea what he could be doing?" "Probably a scribble his mother will hang on the wall and be proud of." "That's a shame." Her friend didn't dare to answer, but her face reflected her embarrassment. Elizabeth, on the other hand, felt pleasure. That little boy in the wheelchair, with his worn sneakers and old t-shirt, looked like the embodiment of everything she despised. Weakness, poverty, insignificance. He had no place in her world. But Elizabeth didn't know that this world, built on her arrogance, would begin to crumble right here, by this wheelchair, with every stroke the boy put on the paper. "Look how touching it is." Elizabeth's voice rang with false pity, echoing through the park. "A little artist in a wheelchair. Do you think he's painting his miserable existence, or is he trying to portray something he'll never achieve?" The words, filled with venom, fell on the silence like sharp shards of glass. A few people froze when they heard her, looking around, but no one dared speak. Elizabeth had never faced judgment before, and today was no exception. Even her friend only furtively glanced at the boy, trying to hide the awkwardness. The boy didn't react. His head was still bent over the sketchbook, the pencil in his hands moving across the paper. But his fingers turned white with tension, and the lines in the drawing became sharper, angrier, as if his emotions were reflected in every stroke. "Why is he here?" Elizabeth continued, addressing a group of people standing nearby. "This is a park for walking, not an exhibition of suffering. Didn't anyone explain to his parents that there are special institutions for such people? Maybe he's the kind of guy who lives at the expense of others." The voice of a man standing by the fountain supported her. The words were louder than he had expected, but instead of shame, he was strangely satisfied that he was on the side of the strong. The others began to whisper. Elizabeth noticed how her words ignited the fire of discussion and felt like the mistress of the moment. She straightened slightly, as if enjoying her role. "And what can he do?" she threw, pointing at the boy. "Even if he learns to paint, who will buy it? It's useless. He should be in an orphanage or—" She faltered because at that moment the boy raised his head. His gaze was silent but burning. His eyes, large and dark, seemed to absorb all the pain and humiliation he had endured in his life. This gaze was not the gaze of a child. It was the look of a man who saw and felt more than most adults. But he didn't say anything, not a word. Instead, he returned to his drawing, as if he had closed himself off from the world. His wheelchair became like a fortress, a symbol of his loneliness and his strength at the same time. "Look at him," Elizabeth said, squinting. "He can't even speak. Probably lacks courage or vocabulary. Will someone tell him he shouldn't waste paper?" The crowd laughed, quietly, tentatively, but the laughter built up until it grew louder. The boy didn't move, only drawled, but his shoulders tensed and his breathing became harsh. It was as if the people around them had been given permission to be humiliated. The whispers grew louder, and one man's voice broke out. "Maybe he's not even here legally. Have you seen who his parents are? Or is he just another orphan?" Those words echoed in everyone. Elizabeth felt the excitement of the crowd begin to fuel her excitement. A sense of superiority flared within her. She took a step closer to the boy, leaning in so she could see his drawing. "Come on, little artist," she said, her voice filled with an almost sweet jeer. "Show us your masterpiece. Or are you afraid it will turn out to be as pathetic as you are?" The boy raised his head slowly. His gaze met hers again, but this time something else flashed in it, a quiet resistance. He said nothing, but the look was so piercing that Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. "Ha! Even now you're silent," she threw, but her voice trembled slightly. He returned to his drawing as if the world around him had ceased to exist. His pencil moved quickly, creating something on the paper that was already, at that moment, more than a simple drawing. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from. Maybe there have been moments in your life when you, too, faced injustice, prejudice, or unexpected encounters that changed your view of the world. Your stories will help make our storytelling even more alive and profound. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation and other interesting stories. We continue. Elizabeth sat on her favorite terrace, gracefully sipping coffee from a porcelain cup decorated with a delicate gold pattern. She liked to start her mornings with thoughts of her perfect world. In her mind, it was a place where everything was in strict order. The strong ruled, the weak disappeared, and every deviation from the norm was punishable by isolation. This park used to be such a nice place, she reflected, looking at her impeccably manicured nails. Now, you see all kinds of people here. Migrants, beggars, people in wheelchairs. It's just becoming unacceptable. Her thoughts returned to the scene of the day before. The face of the boy in the wheelchair, his gaze full of silent resistance, resurfaced in her mind. Elizabeth waved the image away irritably, as if trying to erase it from her mind. "Men like him only burden society," she said to herself, rising from her chair and walking past the huge mirror that reflected her gorgeous image. "They have neither power nor utility. They take up space that could be given to those who could contribute." Elizabeth remembered the stories of her family. Her grandfather, the owner of a huge factory, had often said, "There are two kinds of people, those who move the world and those whom the world must leave behind." These words became her credo. There was no room for pity in her world, only pragmatism. But what annoyed her even more was that the boy was not only weak physically. His appearance, his thinness, his clothes, everything pointed to his low status. What's the point of helping someone like that? She pondered once upon a time at one of her charity meetings. It only encourages their helplessness. Her contempt had its roots. Elizabeth truly believed that her success was the result of her effort and superiority. And if someone was poor, or worse, born in a different part of the world, that was their problem, not hers. She often repeated to her friends, "You should only help those who deserve it, and weakness never deserves to be rewarded." Her own words from the day before in the park echoed in her head. Don't his parents realize he'll never be a part of something great? Those words had brought her satisfaction then, but now something dark was moving inside her. It made her angry that the boy didn't answer. He just stared, and his silence, that awful silence, seemed louder than any words. She recalled her trip to a poor country where her luxury car was stopped at every turn by beggars. She thought then, if they would just get them off the streets, the world would be a much cleaner place. She didn't say it out loud, but her companions like her silently agreed. Now, the boy from the park became to her a symbol of everything she despised. He was weak and poor, and, in her opinion, useless. But there was something else about him, something that wouldn't let her just forget about him. Elizabeth glanced at her reflection and adjusted her necklace. "It's simple," she said to herself. "This world belongs to those who are strong enough to rule it. The rest are just shadows that will fade away sooner or later." But deep down, something was stirring. She couldn't call it guilt, more like annoyance that this boy in the wheelchair, with his piercing gaze and silence, had left a mark on her thoughts. The pencil in his hands moved with such speed as if it were the only way to escape. The boy, sitting in his wheelchair, drew lines on the paper, curved and sharp, as if they could protect him from the words coming from all directions. But they didn't. "Tell me, do you even realize why you're here?" Elizabeth spoke again, standing only a few feet away from him. Her voice, full of venom, cut through the silence. "Or did your parents bring you here so everyone could see what a disaster their family is in? Maybe they think it will cause pity?" The words sounded loud, scalding the air. A man from the crowd added with a chuckle, "Pity? More like they just want attention. That's what they're trying to hide behind these days." The boy continued to draw. His face remained hidden, but his hands trembled. Each stroke became sharper, deeper. The lines crisscrossed, as if he were trying to imprison himself in a world where these people, their looks, their hatred could not reach him. His silence was like a challenge. He couldn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew his words wouldn't change anything. They would laugh. They would find new ways to remind him that he was weak, that he was a stranger. "Look at his hands," someone in the crowd chuckled. "He's even holding a pencil like he's about to break it. Maybe he won't succeed. And who's going to look at those scribbles anyway?" Elizabeth leaned closer to examine the sketchbook. Her shadow fell across the drawing. "Oh, of course," she said with a cold chuckle. "You draw people. You probably try to imagine what you might have been if you hadn't been in that wheelchair. But you realize that's just fantasy, right? It's never going to be your reality." The boy froze for a moment. His hand, clutching the pencil, stopped in midair, but he didn't lift his head. Instead, he went back to his drawing, as if the woman's words were just a breeze he wasn't afraid of. His inner world was full of pain. These people, they saw only his wheelchair, only his weakness, only his immobile legs. They didn't see how many times he had heard those words, didn't see how they had wrecked his childhood. He remembered how once in school a teacher had told him, "You can never compete, but you can sit and watch. That's important too." The words, which were said with sympathy, cut him harder than the taunts, but at this point he decided not to stop. The lines on the paper became more and more confident. The pencil in his hands took on a voice he didn't have. He wasn't just drawing people, he was drawing a story of suffering that had become a source of strength. "Look at this," came another voice from the crowd. "It's like this guy doesn't even know what we're saying. Maybe he's just deaf." Laughter erupted all around, but the boy continued. His drawing was his shield. In every line was his pain, his protest. In every detail he showed that he had a world they would never penetrate, a world where their words meant nothing. Elizabeth felt irritated. It always pissed her off when someone didn't respond to her comments. She was used to her words being taken as truth. But this boy didn't break. His ignoring wasn't just resistance, it was a slap in the face. "Good," she said with a venomous smile. "Keep drawing. But remember, when you're done, it stays here, on this dirty paper, because you're the dirt that no one will ever notice." The boy put the finishing touch on it. He raised his head, meeting her gaze, but there was no fear or anger on his face. Only silence. A silence that pressed harder than any words. The boy sat in his wheelchair, gripping the notebook as tightly as if it were his only protection. There was still laughter, whispering, scornful phrases, but he was no longer listening. He closed himself in his silence, and in that silence images of the past surfaced, as if someone had reopened all the old wounds. He remembered the first time he heard the word freak. He was 6 years old and had just learned how to use his wheelchair. He tried to catch up with the kids on the playground, but his little hands couldn't spin the wheels fast enough. They stopped and stared at him as if he were not a person but some strange object. One of the boys, the loudest and strongest, shouted, "Look at his feet. They don't even move. Why is he here? He can't play anything anyway." Everyone laughed, and he realized for the first time that the wheelchair would not only be his support, but also his stigma. He remembered how his teacher at school always put his desk in the corner, separate from the others. "It will be more comfortable for you that way," she had said with a strained smile. "You won't be able to participate in the general activity after all." But her voice was aloof rather than kind, as if she wanted to get rid of the need for his presence as soon as possible. The other children looked at him furtively, as if he were something dirty, something to stay away from. "He's too weak to be one of us," a classmate once said. Those words stayed in his memory forever. That was the first time he felt the pain become a shadow that would haunt him forever. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst of it was when he saw people on the street turn away when they saw him. Pity and contempt were written on their faces at the same time. Some quickened their steps as if he was contagious. Others whispered as they looked at him, thinking he couldn't hear. He remembered the woman at the bus stop who had once said loudly for all to hear, "Why don't they leave those at home? It's just unseemly. No one wants to look at their ugliness." He was 10 at the time. He was holding his first drawings that he wanted to show his mom, but those words hit him so hard that he threw the drawings into the nearest trash can. His wheelchair became a symbol that he would always be different, not like everyone else. It separated him from the world. People only saw it. The cold metal, the fixed wheels, the handles he clung to so often that they became smooth and shiny. To them, he was just a part of that wheelchair, not a boy with dreams. But he found his refuge in drawing, in a world where colors and lines could create things he could never achieve. Here he could walk, run, fly. His pencil gave him the freedom that his legs could not. He drew his happiness, his hopes, even his tears, and each drawing became his answer to this hard, indifferent world. But today, this world was tearing him apart again. The rich woman's words, the crowds, those scornful looks, all of it brought him back to those first wounds he'd tried to forget. But he wouldn't let himself break. His art wasn't just escapism. It was his fight, his weapon. He took a deep breath, picked up his pencil, and went back to his drawing. A fire burned in his eyes, quiet but indomitable. They could only see him as a boy in a wheelchair, weak and useless. But his art will say what he himself cannot say, and it will silence them. Elizabeth tapped her heel nervously on the tiles. The scene playing out before her had begun to lose its poignancy, and the boy in his wheelchair seemed almost indifferent, despite her demeaning words. His calmness irritated her. The crowd around her was no longer laughing so loudly, and many began to disperse, disappointed that the boy was not given in. "Well," she said as if addressing herself, but loud enough for the others to hear, "let's see what you spent your time on." Her heels clacked loudly on the path as she approached him. She leaned over, crossing her arms over her chest to peer into his sketchbook. She expected to see something ridiculous in there, crude, clumsy lines, images devoid of meaning. Perhaps a scribble or two that would reflect his pathetic world. Her contempt piqued, but what she saw made her heart stop. There was a portrait on the page. It was her portrait, but it was not the Elizabeth she was used to seeing in the mirror. In the drawing, her face was contorted with anger, her eyes burned with cold contempt, and around her hovered a shadow as heavy as a mountain collapse. Behind her back were hundreds of faceless figures, their faces turned into emptiness, their bodies like broken silhouettes. In these people, she immediately recognized those she despised, the poor, the vulnerable, the unwanted. But in this drawing, they were the ones who were alive, and she was just an empty shell surrounded by her own arrogance. Every line was precise, every detail screamed truth. Her neck seemed stretched like a bird of prey, her lips curved in a smirk of contempt. The portrait captured her entire inner world, a world full of hatred, prejudice, and cold calculation. Elizabeth recoiled. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she quickly clenched them into a fist so no one would notice. "What is it?" Her voice sounded harsh, but with a tremor she couldn't hide. The boy raised his head. There was no fear or anger in his eyes, only silence. He looked straight at her, and that look was stronger than any words. He seemed to see right through her, every weakness, every lie she told. The crowd began to return. People craned their necks curiously to look at the drawing. Some of them gasped. "It's unbelievable," muttered a woman with a child standing nearby. "It's even creepy," someone else added. Elizabeth felt her perfect mask begin to crack. She realized that her image, a strong, confident woman who controlled those around her, had been exposed. The boy in the wheelchair, the one she thought was insignificant, showed her true face. "You think this is funny?" she hissed, but her voice was weak. The boy didn't answer. He only turned the next page. There was a new drawing, this time a scene from the park. She stood surrounded by people who were laughing, and in the center, like a glowing island, was a picture of his wheelchair. But instead of appearing pathetic, it looked like a symbol of resilience. Every line, every stroke was imbued with a strength that no one around him could break. Elizabeth couldn't tear her gaze away. She felt her legs grow weak, the weight of an incomprehensible feeling pressing down on her chest. It wasn't just humiliation. It was something more, a feeling that her world, her truth, had crumbled. "It's just a drawing," she muttered, trying to look away. But she knew she wasn't. The boy in the wheelchair had shown her the truth she had been hiding even from herself. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from. Maybe you've had similar situations in your life where you faced prejudice, injustice, or unexpected moments that changed your perception. Your stories inspire us to keep telling these stories. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the further development of this story and other interesting stories. We continue. The crowd gathered around, the boy continued to grow, and the tension in the air became almost palpable. The people who a moment ago had only glanced at him and listened to Elizabeth's taunts were now unable to take their eyes off his drawing. One by one, they moved closer to get a better look at what had stunned her so. But instead of the scribbles they had all expected to see, a picture of deep meaning and painful truth was revealed before them. The faces of the audience began to change. Some were embarrassed, some were confused, and some just stood there, unable to find the words. It wasn't just a drawing. It was a story told without words, but it spoke more than any monologue. People saw him not only as a boy trapped in a wheelchair, but also as their own shadows. Their prejudice, their coldness, their willingness to turn away from the weak. There was an awkwardness in the eyes of many, as if someone had just ripped off their masks. It's incredible," the woman in the bright red coat muttered, carefully reaching out to touch the edge of the notebook. "He sees us, as we are. Elizabeth, standing in the center of this circle of attention, felt her confidence slowly melting away. Something inside her was being torn apart. Her perfect world, where the weak were weaker and she always remained superior, had cracked. She knew that her power had always been in her ability to control the crowd. But right now, the crowd wasn't looking at her. All eyes were fixed on the drawing and the boy who seemed suddenly taller than her. "Look at this," the man said, leaning closer. "It's not just a portrait. It's like a mirror. It's a mockery of everything we think about ourselves." Elizabeth felt her face begin to burn. Her lips pressed into a thin line and she tried to regain control. "Come on," she said sharply, trying to break the tense silence. "It's just a drawing. You're over-dramatizing everything." But her voice sounded different than it had before. It didn't cut through the air like a knife. It trembled, and people noticed it. No one looked at her. Even her closest friend, always supportive of her every word, stood silent, her gaze wandering between the drawing and the boy in the wheelchair. "Maybe you're being dramatic, Elizabeth," someone in the crowd said quietly. The voice was female, but low and firm. "Maybe he showed us for who we are. Look at you. You recognize yourself in that drawing, don't you?" Elizabeth turned, her eyes burning with cold anger. She looked for someone who dared to challenge her, but the face was lost in the crowd. Her body tensed. She tried to remember what she always did in situations like this, how she turned her enemies into targets so she could feel in control again. But the boy in the wheelchair was a foreign target to her. He was beyond her manipulation. Meanwhile, the crowd began to speak louder and louder. People were discussing the drawing, each one finding something different in it. "It's about us," said an elderly man with a cane. "We laugh at him, but he laughs back at us. And he laughs right back. It's pain," whispered a young girl standing in the front row. "He painted his pain, and we just didn't see it." Elizabeth realized that the situation was getting out of control. People were no longer supporting her. Moreover, she could feel the attention she was so used to receiving turning against her. Her ideal image that she had built up for so long was beginning to crumble. "It's all nonsense," she said loudly, trying to shout over the whispers of the crowd. "It's just a drawing. You all get caught up in your emotions like children. That boy, he means nothing. His art means nothing." But her words no longer carried weight. Her voice, which had once been able to turn the crowd in the right direction, now sounded false. People were not listening to her. Their eyes were fixed on the boy who sat silently with his head down. "You're the one who means nothing," someone in the crowd said suddenly. The voice was low and harsh. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The crowd froze, and all eyes turned to Elizabeth. She felt as if her feet were weighted to the ground. Her world, her control, her power, it was all crumbling. And it wasn't a strong, powerful man who did it. It was a boy in a wheelchair who didn't even say a word. Elizabeth sat in her luxurious study, surrounded by a silence that was no longer her ally. The fine furniture, the antique lamps, the expensive paintings on the walls, all the things that had once served to remind her of her status, now seemed alien. She couldn't escape the image of the boy in the wheelchair, his quiet gaze that saw right through her, and the drawing where she first saw herself as she might have always been. She fidgeted with the corner of the white napkin, feeling something inexplicable, heavy inside her, as if the world she'd built around herself was beginning to press in on her from the inside. For the first time in a long time, Elizabeth felt fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from a physical threat, but fear of herself, of the truth she had been so careful to hide. Her own voice sounded in her head, venomous and sharp. "Men like him will never rise. They are a shadow of society. Trash." She had repeated it like a mantra throughout her life, but now the words that used to give her confidence seemed deaf and useless. She got up and walked over to the mirror, looking at her reflection. It was the same woman in the mirror. Impeccably styled hair, expensive jewelry, delicate facial features that she considered a symbol of her superiority. But now she saw something else, something the boy had captured in his drawing. Her eyes, always cold and confident, now seemed empty to her. There was a pain hidden in them that she had long ignored, a pain she had made others feel in order not to feel it herself. Memories began to surface one by one. She remembered herself as a teenager when her parents first moved their family to the big city. She was the daughter of wealthy but not influential enough people, and the local elite society had immediately made her realize that her provincial background made her an outsider. "You must have come here from some dirty settlement," a girl in her class once told her, looking at her with the same disdain she looked at the boy in the wheelchair today. "Look at your clothes. It's not even real designer." Elizabeth remembered how she had felt small and insignificant then, standing in the middle of the hallway. She couldn't respond. She just stood there while laughter erupted all around her. She made a promise to herself then. She would never be weak again, never let anyone make fun of her, and she would do anything to become the one who laughed, not the one being laughed at. But now that promise was turning against her. The boy in the wheelchair wasn't laughing. He was just watching, and his silence was louder than any laughter. She remembered his drawing, the empty eyes, the face disfigured with contempt. She couldn't escape the thought that he was seeing the real her, not what she wanted to be, but what she had become. Her thoughts went back to the park. She saw the faces of the people surrounding the boy, heard their words. Those words weren't addressed to her, but they burned her like fire. "You're the one who means nothing," that woman in the crowd said. And for the first time, Elizabeth felt it was true. Her influence, her power, her arrogance, all of it was powerless against the silent strength of the boy trapped in the wheelchair. But what frightened her most was the guilt that began to stir inside her. She had never believed in pity or regret. She considered them a weakness. But now this feeling, like a heavy black shadow, began to fill her mind. She tried to shake it off, remembering her earlier excuses. "I was just telling the truth. People like him really don't accomplish anything." But even those words sounded hollow now. She recalled another scene from her youth. Her mother sitting in the living room talking to one of the guests. People of a different color? "Oh, they just can't be the same as us. It's in their nature." Those words, spoken with such certainty, had seemed true to her at the time. But now they echoed in her head, causing only disgust. Her mother had believed herself to be right, and so did she. But were they right? Elizabeth walked back to her chair, feeling the weight of her thoughts making her legs shake. She tried to convince herself that it was all nonsense, that the boy, his drawing, his wheelchair, was just an accident that didn't matter. But she knew that it didn't. Something about him, in his silence, in his gaze, in his art, made her think about things she'd tried to forget, things she had kept hidden even from herself. She felt her hands begin to tremble. It wasn't just guilt. It was a realization. The realization that her strength had always been an illusion, and that the boy she thought was weak had turned out to be stronger than her. Elizabeth returned to the park the next day, despite her inner resistance. She justified her decision by saying she just wanted to take a walk, but deep inside she knew the truth. She was looking for him, the boy in the wheelchair, the one who, the day before, had shattered her complacent world and made her see herself through the prism of his pencil. She tried to convince herself that it was just a misunderstanding, a random moment of weakness that could easily be fixed. After all, she had the power, the money, the opportunities, everything that could make up for any mistake. Isn't that what makes the strong strong? The ability to buy forgiveness. Her steps were quick and sure, but inside everything clenched. The park seemed foreign to her. Every tree, every bench, every sound reminded her of that day. She saw him at once. He was sitting in his wheelchair again, slightly off to the side, surrounded by silence, as if the world was afraid to disturb his peace. The notebook lay in his lap, and he was once again drawing intently. Elizabeth slowed her step. Her legs, always confident, suddenly began to wobble. She stopped, took a deep breath, and walked over. "You're here again," she said, trying to make her voice sound softer, but there was still a tense coldness to it. She saw his shoulders tense slightly, but he didn't lift his head. His pencil continued to move across the paper as if she were just noise in the background. Elizabeth leaned over to see his face, but the boy stubbornly wouldn't look at her. The silence, which she took as a challenge, burned her. She straightened, crossing her arms over her chest as if trying to regain at least some of her confidence. "Look," she began, struggling to find the words. "I may have been too harsh yesterday. We all say things sometimes that don't always sound right. It doesn't mean anything. I'd like to help you." The boy stopped. His pencil froze, but he still didn't look at her. Elizabeth felt her heart quicken its rhythm. She expected some response, some sign that her words had reached their destination, but his silence was unbearable. "I can get you a good school," she continued, feeling her voice breaking. "Or, if you want, I can get you the best art teachers. You have talent. There's no denying it. You can accomplish something big. You just need a little help. I can give you that." The boy finally raised his head. His eyes met hers, and Elizabeth felt her inner monologue, her self-justification and confidence shatter in an instant. That look, full of quiet contempt, was like a cold knife cutting through her contrived mask. There was no gratitude or appreciation in his eyes that she expected, only a silence that screamed louder than any words. She took a step closer, pulled her checkbook and pen out of her bag. She felt she had to offer him something tangible, something weighty, to make up for yesterday's humiliation. After all, it had always worked before. Money had always been her answer to any problem. "Tell me how much you want." Her voice became almost pleading. "It's easy. You can buy whatever you need. You can be better. Isn't that what you want?" The boy looked at the checkbook, then looked up at it again. He slowly closed his notebook and placed it on his lap. His hands, thin and weak, clutched it as if it were a shield protecting him from whatever she was trying to offer. He said nothing, but his gaze was so eloquent that Elizabeth's legs buckled. He looked at her as if she was empty, as if her money, her power, her apologies didn't matter. "I'm trying to help," she said, but her voice was no longer confident. She sounded panicked. "Why don't you understand? I want to fix this." But the boy turned away. He went back to his drawing, as if she were nothing more than a shadow that had come and gone. This silent rejection was worse than any words. Her offers, her money, her attempt to make amends, all of it was unnecessary. She stood before him, a boy in a wheelchair who was weaker than she was in everything but one way. He possessed a strength she had never had. Elizabeth felt something inside her break. She wanted to say something else, but her throat constricted. Her power, her money, her apologies were powerless, and that was unforgivable. The next day, the park looked as usual. People were walking around, laughing, feeding the birds. But something had changed. The very same boy in a wheelchair was again at the center of events. Only now it was not just a crowd of curious people gathered around him. It was a group of people who had come to see his drawing, the same one that had silenced the rich and powerful Elizabeth de Montfort. His work had taken on a life of its own. Someone took a picture of the drawing and posted it on the internet. The image, soaked with pain and truth, spread across social networks with incredible speed. People wrote comments and shared stories. Some told of how they were humiliated for their appearance. Others recalled words that shattered dreams. The boy's drawing became more than a piece of art. It became a symbol. The lines that depicted Elizabeth's eyes full of contempt and her smirk hiding emptiness captured not only her, but the entire structure of a society built on prejudice. The shadows in the background, the faceless figures of the weak and rejected, spoke for the millions who have ever felt unwanted. People saw themselves in this drawing, and most importantly, they saw the truth they were used to turning away from. The crowd around the boy was growing. Some came up and quietly said words of gratitude to him. Others just stood there, not knowing how to express their feelings. But the boy remained silent. His eyes, as before, were full of calm confidence. He did not explain anything. He just kept drawing, as if he were creating a new world where prejudices would have no power. Elizabeth watched everything from a distance. Her face was no longer as confident as it used to be. She kept to the shadows, avoiding meeting glances with people who might have recognized her in the drawing. She had seen people discussing his work, talking openly about the injustices they had ignored for so long. And every time she heard it, she felt a heaviness grow inside her. She remembered how she had tried to buy his forgiveness yesterday by offering money and patronage, how she'd hoped her usual tools of control would help her regain her grip on the situation. But his silent refusal had destroyed her more than she could have imagined. She realized that her power was an illusion. In this park, in front of this boy in a wheelchair, she was helpless. A few days passed. The boy's drawing became a sensation. It was discussed in the news. Artists admired his talent, and activists used it as a symbol of the fight against prejudice. People who used to pass by people like him now stopped to think. The story of how a rich woman was put in her place without a word spread throughout the city. But the boy himself had disappeared. No one knew where he was. He was last seen in the park, sitting in his wheelchair, finishing another drawing. After that, he simply disappeared, leaving behind only his work. His last work was found on one of the benches, a picture of an empty city, with only silhouettes instead of people. On one of the streets was a drawing of a wheelchair standing alone under the dim light of a street lamp. This drawing was his last message, full of longing but also hope. People kept telling his story. They said his work was a reminder that humanity cannot be measured by money or status. Everyone who saw his drawings left with the feeling that something had changed in their heart. Elizabeth was alone in her huge house. She couldn't shake the feeling that the boy in the wheelchair, by his silence, by his art, had changed her forever. She could no longer look in the mirror without seeing those empty eyes he had painted. His masterpiece became her eternal reminder of her weakness, but it also became a chance for her to change something. For the first time in her life, she felt she had to do something real, and that feeling, like the boy's story, began to live on beyond her name. Friends, think about how often we judge people based on their appearance, status, or what we think makes them different. This story of a boy in a wheelchair is a mirror we need to hold up to ourselves. After all, how many times have we passed by, looking down on them or just averting our eyes, thinking that these people are just shadows? But don't we have something in ourselves that others might judge us for? Don't we have weaknesses, fears, or moments when we felt insignificant? Think of someone in your life who, despite hardships, showed a strength of spirit you didn't even realize you had. Maybe this is a story about you, or about how you treated others. It is important to realize humanity is not measured by how much we have or how we look, but by how we are able to see the value in others. This boy has shown through his drawing that everyone has a voice, even if it is not heard through words. His art is not just a protest. It is a lesson for all of us, a lesson that strength and beauty live inside, not outside. I ask you to consider, how often do we become like Elizabeth, living in her world of illusion? How often do we refuse to recognize that our perceptions of others may be wrong? After this story, I hope you will reflect as I did on the fact that there is a light in every person, regardless of their position or capabilities. And it is our responsibility to honor that light. Share in the comments how this story made you feel. Maybe it reminded you of something that happened in your life. Perhaps you've seen people who have shattered prejudice with their power, or perhaps you've done it yourself at some point. Write it down. Your story is important. And most importantly, don't forget that this lesson doesn't just need to be heard. It needs to be put into practice. Friends, we want to know what you think about this story. Write in the comments what feelings it evoked in you. Have you ever experienced racism, prejudice, or unfair treatment of yourself or others? Perhaps you have seen others fall victim to such situations, or have you experienced it yourself? These topics are relevant to all of us, and your opinions and experiences can be a valuable contribution to the discussion. It is very important for us to hear your stories. They help us understand how these problems are reflected in real life, and, most importantly, what we can do to become better. Every comment, every story is a step towards greater understanding, towards fighting injustice and prejudice. We sincerely appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you for listening to our stories, reflecting with us, and sharing your opinions. Your participation makes our project deeper and more human. If you like this story or it made you think, subscribe so you don't miss new ones. Give us a like to help us recognize that these topics are important to you and to keep bringing them up. We wish you a wonderful day full of kindness, warmth, and the realization of how important our actions towards others are. Thank you for being with us.